Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 81 and audio season 4, episode 19 of Music is Not a Genre. Thank you as always for listening and watching. Don't forget you can support this podcast 3 different ways by going to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre and signing up there. That I would love that. You get exclusive content, early releases of both audio and video of every single podcast. You can go to anchor.fm/musicisnotagenre for the audio podcast, every episode there, and it gives you an opportunity to donate any amount you want. Everything you donate helps support all the time and effort I put into creating all of this. And as always, you can see most of what I do at my hub, youtube.com/Nick DiMatteo. Let's get right to it. As you can hear, my voice is a little tired, and it's because I had a couple of gigs this past weekend, and I'm rehearsing for another couple of gigs coming up. So it's a busy time of year, just busy in general for whatever reason. And, I'm a little tired, but I'm excited about this. I think it's the perfect podcast to do when you're tired, because it's kind of hard to stay tired when you're talking about this particular subject. And for those of you just listening who can't see my display here, the title is Eminem, one of the greatest poets of all time. Notice the question in that? Yeah, so I might answer it. I don't know. So I do, as you know, I have various versions of this podcast. The primary one is me going into my collection and choosing an artist, usually more than one album, to discuss and dissect and break down in a certain way, maybe not in a conventional way or in the way other people do, but I have an angle for it, right? Some of those artists are easier than others. Some are just utterly overwhelming to tackle. Prince was one. Red Hot Chili Peppers. The Beatles will be when I get there. Matthew Sweet was one. Chicago was one, and I plan on doing another Chicago episode sometime, probably next year. And those are primarily because they all mean so much to me. All those artists mean so much to me that to get beyond the breadth and depth of what I know and feel about them and distill it into 30 to 60 minutes is not easy, right? There are other reasons why artists are overwhelming, though. Another example would be just sheer volume. People like Dylan or Zappa, Johnny Cash, even Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton, another great example. Huge bodies of work. Just to imagine to create a podcast and get enough of a spin on all of that and distill it again into such a short amount of time is overwhelming in some ways. Maybe not as overwhelming, though, as the first batch, because again, when you're close to something, it's a little harder to dissect it. And on that note about volume, I was doing research, who put out the most albums. Apparently Buckethead holds the record with 166. It may be more by now. I don't know when that number was put out, but all right, Buckethead, yes, keep creating. Eminem, this week's subject, is overwhelming for a slightly different reason. And it's, maybe 2 reasons. One is there are so many angles to take on this. We can talk about the controversy. We can talk about, is there some element of the controversy in his lyrics and, and content and all that. We can talk about, is there some element of appropriation and, what he does. We can talk about his personal life. We can talk about all of the music itself and the work he did with Dr. Dre and beyond, and the people, the stewardship, and other people that he grew up with, or other artists that he's worked with and helped turn their career for. And I may touch on some of those things today, but of course I'm picking possibly the hardest, which is his lyrics, but not in particular, let me recite a bunch of lyrics and dissect meaning and all of that stuff. But to harken back to the title of this, his lyrics in the context of poetry, and whether or not, you think that his lyrics are poetry, or B, you think any music lyrics at all are poetry, or only some poetry. And I did a podcast on this a while back, and I will absolutely touch on that question for sure. But the reason why I framed this podcast in this way is because, as usual, and I've said this about other music topics, popular music often gets short shrift when it comes to comparing it to literary masterworks or things that are considered more highbrow. I did a podcast called the no brow approach, and that is 100% because I believe that while there is a distinction in delivery, in the way something is presented, in the language that's used and things like that, I think that the distinction between highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow, that's all just false, and it's all very subjective and judgmental. And in the case of Eminem here, what it really does is it kind of sheds a negative light on what otherwise might be considered just lyrics, and in my mind, to my mind, poetry. And I'll get right. Let me just get this out of the way right now, since I keep bringing this up. And that is that I do consider all lyrics a form of poetry. Do I consider all lyrics great poetry? No. Do I think all lyrics aspire to be poetry? No. But to me, the difference between prose and poetry is poetry has within it a musicality to it, even if it's not related to music. The way that you express yourself within poetry, you are deliberately finding rhythms and certain sounds that go together, and that's very musical. And so even if you're talking about, again, Louie Louie, a song as simple as that, or you're talking about the works of Bob Dylan, in each case, there was an aspiration to create something musical in the words that are being used. And so, yes, I think all music is a form of poetry. I think anybody who says otherwise believes that legit poetry deserves some kind of a higher place in the pantheon of artistic works, and I couldn't disagree more, because there's as much bad poetry as there is bad music lyrics, and they may be bad for different reasons, but they may not, So that's where I'm starting from, that all lyrics are poetry. And in the case of Eminem, if you know anything about Eminem, he is just incredibly dexterous, incredibly dexterous. You can even talk about his freestyling and how someone could come up with lyrics as quickly as he could. And yes, I understand that if you look at the top of my thing here, I have a kind of an auxiliary CD pick here, 8 Mile, because of how popular it made him, and that may actually contain his most famous or second or third most famous song, ironically not on any of his albums, and that there were scenes in there where his character freestyled and all that, but that came from a place of truth in his past, and that's not even what I'm talking about. His ability to craft a lyric and what he does with those words is as poetic and as accomplished as many of the great poets. I actually was going to call this podcast, is he the greatest selling poet of all time? But he's not, and I don't think he may, if you count sheer numbers, he may fall somewhere in the top 10 or 20, but I didn't look this up. All I saw was that, it's estimated that the poems of Shakespeare, works of Shakespeare, have sold 2 and 4 billion copies over the centuries. And then you have, some of the other greats, and I can't remember the list because I decided not to call it that because that was just not the case. But as far as him being a wordsmith, just a master of wordplay, you can, and creating stories, creating characters, his flow, his dexterity, and his clarity, not just clarity in how he speaks and raps, but clarity of expression, of intent, of what he's trying to say, can be very the words can turn in on each other and the meanings can turn in on each other, but when you really read it or listen to it, you see, oh, there's a very clear meaning here, or several often. But I wrote down, some terms: internal rhymes, near rhymes, alliteration, assonance and consonance, multisyllabic rhyming, especially, all poetic terms and techniques, and he uses them all. And yes, many other lyricists use them all. I've used them all. But he takes particular care to pack in as much as he possibly can in a way that just blows your mind every time you listen to it. Density was the word I used, that his lyrics are so dense, his approach to lyricism is so dense. That's what's overwhelming about this. So I enlisted my brother, Dave, to help me out, give me some examples of lyrics. Sadly, I can't find them. I may put them in a comment or something. So Dave, you're listening. Sorry, I don't know what I did with them, but I did actually put a lyric down here myself as an example that I thought was, kind of pulled in a lot of those terms, techniques that I mentioned. My pen and paper cause a chain reaction to get your brain relaxing. The zany acting maniac in action, a brainiac. In fact, son, you mainly lack attraction. You look insanely whack when just a fraction of my tracks run. Now, I counted 9 multisyllabic near rhymes in there. That's insane to me. And that may not even be the best example of the things he does. But I can remember when I first heard him that it was the lyricism that blew me away the most, and his ability to get all of that out and not trip over it and do it with emotion. Absolutely incredible. It's never rote. He never just, oh, I need to get this out. Comes at it from every angle and does incredibly well. I read this thing said in 2015. Music Match, which is the lyric company. So if you see lyrics now on Spotify, it's because of them, and other places. If you look up lyrics, you're usually getting it from them. That Eminem, of all well-known music acts, has the largest vocabulary with over 8,800 unique words used. Second is Jay-Z, with about 2,000 fewer than that. Still amazing. And it turns out that the top 4 were all hip-hop artists. I'm forgetting one. I think Kanye was one of them, and then there was a 4th one. And then the 5th was Dylan. And yeah, I mean, partly that's just volume, but partly, yes, of course it's Dylan. And if people usually think of music, musician/poet, they often think of Dylan or Leonard Cohen, people like that. And that is an example of intent and desire to want to communicate in a way that's as comprehensive as possible. And now, listen, I'm not dancing around any other issue because A, I feel like these other issues have been talked to death about. But, B, I think that while they are significant, they're a sidebar to all of this. And, that's because we can debate content, till we die, and for centuries after. The content of some of the greatest works in history is still debated. And part of that is because each new era puts it in a different context, and I think it's important to reinterpret things or to understand the context in which it was created so that you can pull from it its value without trashing the entire thing because of some, cultural thing, acknowledging that it has some deficiency in what it's saying, but still acknowledging its greatness in some way. And I think with Eminem, the first thing is that there might be some legitimacy to people saying, well, there's a certain level of shock value and some of that, or when he disses other celebrities, other acts, I think that's Yeah, that's a very common hip hop thing, but I think that never felt like something. And I remember thinking when he started doing that, oh wow, he's searching, because he had a heyday, greatest selling, musician at that point, I think, or in this century, and that surprised me and even disappointed me in a little way. But other than that, most of the content that's criticized has to do with how disturbing it is. And the thing is, Eminem demands that you listen beneath the surface. And demands, when I say, like, hits you in the face over and over and over and over again with the things he's saying and how he says it. And it can be very, deadening. It can really dull the senses if you are taking it as an assault, as a barrage of negativity. But if you're really listening or reading, I suggest reading in this case only, which is rare. I rarely do that because it takes it out of the way it's being delivered and lets you take it at your own pace. So you can really take in the meaning. Most of what he's saying is, pointing out, he's an illustrator of the grotesque, pointing out the twisted terror of, what's inside so many people and the way people act and how people think of others, misogyny and homophobia and violence and so many things that are horrific. His persona and who he is are often very much confused, and part of that's by design, and it's the kind of in almost a court jester way. But a lot of it is just mistaken, and I think that understand the context of what he's saying. Even a song like "Stan," where you get it's clever, but it's also an illustration of something on purpose. The way TV shows and movies do. The way country songs sing about killers, other types of music, even pop. I don't know. Maxwell Silverhammer there's a good example. Serial killer, right? And plenty of books and poems. The fact that this is done in hip hop and in a way that is so aggressive might put some people off, but I think it's also a bit of a bias there. And so I talk to me if you want about the controversy, but I just don't think that I don't think it's germane and relative to really anything significant at this point. It's like with video games, violent video games, then just don't buy them, or don't watch whatever you think is, if that's not for you. But if it is, or if you find like you want to know more, then listen more deeply and understand. Either try to understand or admit that you aren't putting in the effort, is really how I feel about that. Quick notes that I overlooked because of my exhaustion. I put down some other people down here. Particularly, Catherine mentioned Stephen Sondheim, Lin-Manuel Miranda. When you listen to Eminem's lyrics, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, admits that he was influenced by so many great artists, including Eminem. And I don't think he was certainly the primary one, but he was one of them. And you can see the connection there. You can see how when you read or listen to Sondheim's lyrics, the just where they go is just insanely genius. And yeah, he just died. So I'm kind of glad that there was a reason to bring him up here. And thank you, Catherine, for pointing that out. When I looked online to tried to find one thing about Eminem, which is somebody, and I want to say it was my brother, was talking to me, and that's why I'm doing this, is because my brother suggested, about comparing him to some of the great poets and all that. And he mentioned somebody, but I don't know if it was because he thought that Eminem's style sounded like that great poet. So I looked up, well, has anybody compared his poetry to anyone and said, oh, there's some direct parallels here? Yes and no. His lyrics have been dissected against Shakespeare and Robert Frost and T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, an obscure dude, John Skelton, who was into free verse. And, that I think is all valid dissection, and I'm glad that the connections are being made there, because it's what I'm trying to do here. But no one has yet come up with, the ancestor of this, type of expression that Eminem is doing is such and such. And I'd like to know more about that. Funding for the arts, funding for this podcast would enable me to take a week out and do nothing but research this. But as I said in a different podcast, put the money up. Let's do the study. I'm ready. And beat poetry, of course, and free verse, slam poetry, freestyle, which I mentioned before. I think all of these things are connected, and I think there is a through line. And I think 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when someone looks back on any of hip-hop, but particularly hip-hop that today is considered controversial or aggressive or in some ways disturbing, they will see the vast majority, if not all of it, as folk stories, as storytelling, as characterizing. No, not all of it. Yes, there's a lot of misogyny and homophobia in hip-hop, but again, there's a lot of that in other types of music too. There's not a fairness in singling that out. A quick note about something else that I find wonderful about Eminem is his humor. And again, I credit part of bringing this in to Catherine, because we had this discussion, and I believe she said that any artist who can incorporate humor in what they do is a fully evolved artist, is a more evolved artist. And you can tell me artists are not in the music realm for which that is true, and I will likely agree with you. But for me, I'm thinking of people like some of my favorites, and Bob Dylan, Prince, the Beatles. All of those people have incorporated humor in what they do. They have shown that it's possible to be, quote unquote, self-serious and self-deprecating. Meaningful and ridiculous, goofy. And that is a mark, I think, of an evolved artist. I remember, I've had humor straight through, from the beginning of me writing songs. But it took me a while to release a lot of that humor publicly. Most of what I chose in my earlier recordings was a little self-serious and a little like, oh, people are, not going to understand the context. That's on me. That's not on the world. I eventually understood how I could incorporate humor into the things I was doing. And, just a couple of albums in, it really started having that be a regular part of any of my albums. Certainly not every song, but at some part of every album. And listen, like it or not, and the thing is, Eminem's humor runs the range from self-deprecating to shock humor to potty mouth humor to very intelligent, like you got to listen again humor, and all those levels. I think that it is also a mark of an evolved listener if they can identify humor in music, understand that it doesn't make the music any less, good or serious or important, and also know how to take a joke, and understand when things are being placed in a humorous context and not meant to be taken seriously, which is a risk I think all artists take, and I think it's an absolutely worthy risk. There are a lot of controversial comedians who, will talk about serious issues and are misinterpreted because people don't understand the joke. And then there are a lot of other comedians who aren't very good at framing that joke or doing it for the wrong reasons. But I think that the attempt is worthy. And so before I get into the last part, which you always know is about, how this has influenced me, just a quick, I'm not going to go through a very detailed discography here, but he released an album, Infinite, in 1996, which did terrible business. And it took him another 3 years to pull it together and create the Slim Shady, which just launched him, and Marshall Mathers, kind of the 1-2 punch right there. By the time he got to the Eminem show, he was doing 8 Mile. So that was probably one of his biggest years, if not his biggest year, for so many reasons. And then that was a peak, I would say, probably his biggest peak. And then he released Encore, which is here, right next to my face. And that was considered a bit of a dip. And that was actually the one where I thought, oh man, he's starting to get a little bit more into kind of the dissing game and all of that. And hey, artists have their reasons. I think part of the reason was because there was a lot of pressure, and to be that successful, there's a lot of pressure, and also following up something so big. And he was going through personal issues, and we know that because he then took a 5-year hiatus, partly to go into drug rehab and kind of get himself together, which as far as I know he did. He released here Relapse and Recovery, and I remember thinking, great to hear him again, Relapse. Even better to hear him in Recovery. I thought Recovery he had more solid footing, and it was a bit of a stronger album, in my opinion. And then a couple of years later, as you know, I keep saying I stopped buying CDs in 2011. So in 2013, he released Mathers Lp2. At the time, it's not a great year for me, so I wasn't necessarily following him at the time. So that's probably something that I need to go back and revisit. Let me know what you think of it, though, if you've heard it already. And then in 2017, Revival, which I believe was solid, and Kamikaze the following year, which I remember liking, not as much as my brother liked it, but liked it quite a bit. And there were some real highlights on there for me. And then his album from last year, Music to Be Murdered By, which has so much humor in it. The title itself, what's cool is he did this thing at the beginning which incorporated a voiceover that sounded a lot like Alfred Hitchcock, and I thought, oh man, what a great impersonator, because he said the name of the album and everything. And then I did the research, and it was actually Alfred Hitchcock, because he did a thing called Music to Be Murdered By, so it was kind of based on that. And if you know enough about Alfred Hitchcock, you understand that as scary as the stuff he did and all that, he had a giant streak of humor in him, especially if you remember watching his TV show, which I did in reruns. And there were some real awesome gems in there, and you can hear Eminem kind of searching for new things, and maybe what I would hope is entering into kind of a new era where he is back to telling some serious stories and stuff like that, along with the humor and making it personal. He gets political, which I think is awesome. That's not something that he had always done before, and he kind of grew into that in these last few albums. And I think these days that's kind of important for any artist, especially that. And that's the quick kind of rundown I wanted to. I also want to make mention of somebody named Julia Forrester, who did a comparison of the elements of poetry in Eminem's lyrics. And I think just look that up, Julia Forrester, breaking down the elements of poetry and Eminem's lyrics. Man, I can't read everything that I wrote, and I think it's important to kind of help flesh out what I'm saying here in a way that's more intelligent than I can do it, because this is somebody who actually studies poetry. And even though I was a poet for many, 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 many years, and that did inform and continues to inform my lyrics, I gave it up quite a while ago, and kind of through all of that desire and mental process and everything into my lyrics and other things that I write. Speaking of which, yes, from the moment I heard Eminem, to understand that somebody could tell stories like that and use words like that in hip-hop, he maybe wasn't the first and certainly not the last, but he was the first one that came to my attention. And we could talk about the fact that, he's white and all of that. But I think that's been discussed to death too. And I think, again, when I had the podcast on appropriation, anybody who comes at it from a genuine place and is not just, using a certain type of music as a tool to get somewhere is cool by me. And if you know, whatever you want to say about love him or hate him, you hopefully understand that he's coming at it from a place of strong desire to be doing this, you know, and from how he grew up and the way he listened to music. And so when I heard that, the acrobatics, I thought, oh, I need to figure out how to do that myself, you know, whether or not I'm doing hip hop music. That idea of internal rhyming and multisyllabic rhyming is something that's become like a late game favorite for me, or a current favorite, however you want to classify what I'm doing now. You know, things twisting in on each other and you know, reusing a certain sound in a different place in a line and all of that. You can hear that on a lot of what I've done. You know, I try to keep my lyrics a combination of matter of fact, poetic, and playful. And I think you can interchange those and say which one is more important than the other depending on the song and the lyric. But I think I do a fairly good job of achieving that in any type of music that I do. You can name check songs like "Stop It" from Parts and Labor, my band Rex album Parts and Labor, "Never Tell" from Distance to Empty, "Different People" from the Sunshine Seminar. But in particular, I'm going to single out a song from one of my last releases, Rex Syncope for the Weird, called "Sing Out," and that's spelled S-I-N-G, sing, and out, O-W-W-T. Look it up anywhere, you'll find it. And yeah, it's a hip hop song, and it's also kind of a dance song. It's a fun song. It's a goofy song. It's a silly song. Also inspired by something that Catherine did. Catherine's on that song, as well as my son Will. There's a passage in there that came to me, and it was in very large part influenced by Eminem, and certainly people who came after Eminem who liked the multisyllabic rhyming. And I'm just going to kind of recite it here so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. But as always, I'm going to put this song at the end of the podcast so you can listen to the whole thing and hear these lyrics in context, because I actually rap sing them there, and you'll get that in the recording. I'm a little bit crazy. Weird shit doesn't faze me. You'd have to amaze me, like maybe be Jay-Z. Shout out all the ways we turn nights into days, see? But I'm into grays, D. Shadows where my mind plays free. Sing out this phrase, geez, in 13 different ways, please. And then we do the same phrase, sing out, in 13 languages. And it's just a fun, goofy, happy song. But I think that even in other lyrics in this song, you'll see the influence that I'm talking about. And I'd love to know your opinion of it. I'd love to know what you think of this podcast of Eminem. I read this, forum online from years ago, about 10 years ago, back and forth about whether or not Eminem's lyrics are poetic. Is he a poet? Is he great? And then kind of getting into the broader idea of whether or not music lyrics themselves are poetry, and everyone had their different opinion, which is to say, I want to hear yours. I want to know where you stand on any of this, on all of this. Do you like Eminem? Do you know Eminem at all? Do you like this kind of music? Are you able to look beyond the shock value and controversy of Eminem or any artist and value what they do more holistically, or is it too off-putting? Is it a wall that is put up, you just can't get past it? Discuss. Please comment, let me know, because and you'll probably be in a future podcast with that new series I introduced last week, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I have one more podcast before the end of the year, which will be next week.
So good, it's tragic, it's epic, and it's turns you on. I'm in a good place doing a good thing. I'm in a foot race doing I'm winning. I'm making one move, it's it, and then watch me take over this city. It's not a master plan, I'm ever faster than I gotta be, cause no one's faster than me. I'm the third eye, yeah, I know the scheme. I sing cause it makes me sound supreme, like I'm in a roller coaster inching up the track, going so tick forward, no going back. I'm holding on so quietly, the riot be riling up inside of me. Every inch up there's a little tick, but I can't hear the sound cause my beats are thick. And when I make it up to the highest beam, hands up and it's time to scream, I gotta sing it out.
Every little thing I do is magic. And you want more. Every little thing I do is magic. It's epic, and it turns you on.
It's like I don't know what I think until I say it out loud. For your lady mean it straight as it comes out of my mouth. My beats are so thick that I can't stay down, and you can't escape it either cause it's surround sound.
I'm a little bit crazy, which it doesn't faze me. You have to amaze me, like maybe Big Jay-Z. Shout out all the ways we turn nights into days, see. But I'm in the gray state where my mind plays free. Sing out this phrase, G's, in 13 different ways, please.